Camille Jameson, a successful black woman, faces blatant racism and neglect from Nurse Shannon Whitfield at a hospital after undergoing surgery. Despite Camille's polite and calm demeanor, Shannon dismisses her pain, makes racist remarks, and provides subpar care, leaving Camille to endure both physical and emotional torment. As Camille tries to assert her rights, Shannon's prejudice and hostility grow more evident. The story exposes the insidious ways racism manifests in everyday life, particularly in positions of power, creating a tense and infuriating situation as Camille fights against systemic injustice. Dahlia Thomas was used to the eyes. The slow, appraising looks that flicked over her as she entered a room, as though her presence required explanation. They were something she had learned to ignore, or at least pretend to. She wasn't one of those people who flaunted her success. In fact, she avoided it when she could, choosing instead the humbler, quieter routes through life. The latest sports car, the tailored suits, the constant presence of a team of assistants, those things didn't interest her. Instead, Dahlia found peace in the simplicity of her morning walks, the hum of her small office, and a cup of black coffee brewed just right. But it was precisely this low-key approach to life that had, over time, made her a figure of fascination in circles where her power, her influence, her wealth should have demanded respect. Dahlia was a highly respected surgeon, an advocate for marginalized communities, and the head of one of the most influential medical nonprofits in the country. Her expertise was recognized internationally, her voice frequently heard in policy debates, and her actions were shaping the future of healthcare for underserved populations. Yet, despite all this, Dahlia made it a point to live a life far removed from the gold-plated opulence that others in her position might have chosen. On this particular day, she had chosen the small diner at the corner of Oak Street and Harrison Avenue, a place where she could escape the demanding eyes of the world, if only for an hour. The scent of sizzling bacon and strong coffee filled the air, mixing with the steady hum of the few customers chatting in low tones. This was her ritual on days like this. An hour of silence, a chance to breathe and recalibrate, before diving back into the whirlwind of her responsibilities. Dahlia slipped into a booth near the window, the sunlight catching the edges of her dark brown curls as she folded her coat across the seat. She glanced around the diner, a small smile tugging at her lips. There was a certain comfort in the simplicity of it all. Nothing glamorous, nothing showy, just people being people. As she glanced through the menu, the door opened, and a couple entered, laughing lightly. The man, in his mid-40s, dressed in a sharp suit, his expression self-assured and too polished for this quiet, small-town diner. His eyes flicked around the room, momentarily pausing when they caught sight of Dahlia. She noticed, of course, but kept her gaze steady on the menu. It was a practiced move, the subtle glance to let him know she had seen him, but she wasn't about to let his curiosity dictate her actions. "Morning." The waitress, Ellen, greeted the couple with a bright smile. She was in her late 50s, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her uniform as crisp as her sharp, welcoming tone. "Morning, Ellen," the man replied, the faintest edge of arrogance in his voice, though it was clearly unintentional. He sat down at the counter, his partner following suit. Dahlia didn't mind the stares anymore. She had long learned how to navigate a world that didn't quite know how to handle her black female. Highly successful Dahlia had made it to the top in a world where the odds were stacked against her. But she did so by keeping her head down. Humility had been her shield. As she sipped her coffee, Dahlia heard the man at the counter order a cappuccino. She couldn't help but overhear his conversation with Ellen, who was talking about her grandkids and the small garden she tended to every weekend. "Sounds nice," the man commented, his voice carrying just enough that Dahlia couldn't ignore it. "Yeah, it is," Ellen replied with a sigh, wiping down the counter. "It's just hard sometimes, you know, between working and taking care of them. We make do, though." The man chuckled. "That's the thing with this town, isn't it? It's got its charm, but everything's a little behind the times. Must be hard to get ahead when the opportunities aren't there." Dahlia's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup as she looked at her reflection in the window. Behind the times, she'd heard that sentiment many times before, whispered in meetings, in boardrooms, among those who had enough privilege to write off the small town's struggles as the result of something insurmountable, inherent in the people themselves. The waitress laughed. clearly used to his comment. "Yeah, I suppose. But it's home for me. Some folks would rather leave, but me, I'm sticking around. It's simple, but I like it that way." The man smiled, but his gaze slid toward Dahlia, his eyes assessing. He hesitated before asking, "So, what brings you in today, if you don't mind me asking?" Dahlia's gaze met his. There was nothing overtly rude in his tone, but there was a certain type of condescension in the question. What was a woman like her doing in a place like this? She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She had earned every bit of the success she had. But in places like this, with people who looked at her and saw only the color of her skin and the way she carried herself, it was always a question. She smiled faintly, setting the cup down. "Just grabbing some coffee, no big agenda." The man nodded, clearly content with her answer, but there was something about his air, his posture that made Dahlia bristle. It wasn't overt, not yet, but there was an unmistakable undertone in the way he looked at her. His gaze flicked again, this time staying a little too long on her hands, which rested on the table, the rings that adorned her fingers shimmering slightly in the light. Dahlia forced a breath through her nose, keeping her expression neutral, as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Her fingers brushed across the smooth pages, her mind wandering as she tried to focus on the quiet rather than the tension building at the counter. She was used to being underestimated, to being reduced to someone's idea of a token or a success story. People like him saw her as a symbol of aspiration, as someone who had crossed the line from one of them to something unreachable, something rare. She didn't blame them, not really. It was just part of the reality she had learned to navigate, but there was something different about the way he looked at her today. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion, the kind that came from being uncomfortable with someone who was so obviously outside the box of what he expected. She had been through this countless times, and the routine was always the same. They assumed her success was an accident, or worse, that she had somehow manipulated the system to get where she was. After all, a woman like her didn't belong in a place like this, at least, not according to people who saw success as a zero-sum game. Dahlia quickly snapped her notebook shut as she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor, just loud enough to break the subtle tension that had started to build. She grabbed her purse and nodded to Ellen, giving a polite smile. The man, still sitting at the counter, shot her a look. One that barely masked his judgment. Dahlia was used to it. She had learned long ago that a fleeting glance was often the only acknowledgement she would get from people who had already made up their minds. She was nothing more than an anomaly, a curiosity, rather than someone who truly belonged. Before she left, she turned back to the man. "If you want my advice," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with a hint of something unspoken, "don't judge a book by its cover. It's the quickest way to miss the plot." He blinked, his face tightening as though he hadn't expected the directness of her words. His brow furrowed slightly, but Dahlia was already walking out the door. As the door shut behind her, she paused for a moment, taking a breath. There was a certain stillness in the air today, as though something was coming, something unavoidable. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something larger, something that would test her in ways she wasn't prepared for. But Dahlia was ready. She had fought every step of her life to reach this place, and she knew there was a long road ahead. One step at a time, she would continue to fight. Not just for herself, but for those who didn't have the power to stand up for themselves, for those who still lived in the shadows of a system that wasn't built for them. As she made her way back to her car, her thoughts turned to the man in the diner. His gaze hadn't been curious or admiring. It had been filled with quiet disdain, the kind that came from seeing someone who didn't belong. But Dahlia had seen enough of that to know it would take more than a few sideways glances to stop her. Today might have been small, but the day was coming when she would change everything, and she would do it on her terms. Dahlia stepped out of the diner and into the street, her heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythmic precision. She adjusted her coat, a light black trench that fluttered slightly in the breeze. It was a small town, and yet, the feeling of being watched was constant, always hovering, like a shadow just beyond the light. It wasn't overt, but the glances of people who didn't recognize her still stung. She was used to it, but it didn't make it any less tiring. As Dahlia walked toward her car, she saw the man from the diner, his sharp suit now replaced by a plain, ill-fitting shirt and jeans, standing across the street, speaking to a woman who worked at the local gas station. Her mind immediately went to the familiar, often quiet judgments people like him made about someone like her. Black, wealthy, successful, but in a space where people like her weren't supposed to belong. He hadn't even recognized her fully in the diner, but the moment he'd glanced at her hand, she saw the shift in his eyes. Recognition, judgment. It always came when people realized who she was. The doctors and patients at her charity clinics, the advocacy groups she worked with, and even her own friends who lived in wealthier areas, they all seemed to follow a similar rhythm, one that thought they knew her story just by looking at her. That's what people like him thought too. Sweeping assumptions about her background and worth based on appearance alone, she slid into the driver's seat of her modest sedan, starting the engine, but her thoughts refused to quiet. She had no reason to be bothered by him, but it was difficult not to. Not when, for a second, the weight of assumptions had pressed in on her, making her feel like a fraud in a world that couldn't even begin to understand the struggles she'd endured to reach this point. Minutes later, Dahlia arrived at her office, tucked into the quieter part of the city, far removed from the chaos of the financial district. A sharp contrast to the swanky corporate buildings that towered elsewhere, her space was clean, minimalistic, and humble, just the way she liked it. As she entered the building, her assistant, Amber, greeted her with a smile, holding out a file. "Morning, Dr. Thomas. The board's been asking for your input on the new community healthcare initiative. We also have a few meetings lined up this afternoon. They're all on your calendar." Dahlia returned the smile, nodding, and accepted the file. She had been on the phone with the board members for weeks, fighting for increased funding for healthcare access in underprivileged neighborhoods. It was a battle she fought tirelessly, one where she was used to being dismissed at every turn. She kept a calm, collected face for her team and patients, but inside, a storm always brewed when she dealt with the higher-ups. Dahlia moved to her desk and flipped open the file, quickly skimming the numbers and charts inside. She felt the quiet hum of tension building in her chest, not from the work itself, but from the unspoken biases that weighed heavily on everything she did. The system, no matter how much she succeeded, was still built for people who didn't look like her. It had been her reality from the moment she set foot in medical school, and it remained her struggle now. Her phone buzzed with a message from her lawyer, Langston, alerting her to a new issue. The upcoming meeting with a local judge, an influential figure Dahlia needed on her side to push forward with some of her more ambitious public health initiatives. The challenge was not the judge's stance on healthcare reform. No, the challenge was something far subtler: the judge's discomfort with Dahlia's success, her background, and yes, her race. Dahlia rubbed her temples, trying to push back the headache that was starting to creep in. She had seen this pattern before: men and women in power who either dismissed her or tried to neutralize her with vague comments. Their biases were often hidden under layers of polite professionalism, but Dahlia had come to recognize the signs. It was in the way they refused to meet her gaze for too long, in the way they hesitated before answering her questions, in the way their smiles never quite reached their eyes. She had already prepared for the meeting in her mind, knowing that it would be a delicate dance of power dynamics, but as much as she told herself she was used to it, she knew this wasn't something that would ever become easy. The courthouse was a short drive from her office. When Dahlia arrived, she parked her car in the back lot and walked in through the side entrance. There were no reporters lurking today, no photographers capturing her every step, but that didn't change the feeling. Dahlia had made a point to arrive early, as she always did for any professional engagements. The woman who worked the front desk gave her a polite but distracted nod as she made her way toward the judge's chambers. She was used to the dismissive glances. Her presence felt like an anomaly in these halls. A black woman seeking to influence the policies that affected the lives of those who looked like her. The marginalized, the forgotten. It was in the hall outside the judge's office that she was greeted by Judge Robert Franklin, a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and an expression of authority. His handshake was firm, his smile courteous but detached. Dahlia greeted him with a nod, her voice steady. "Good morning, Judge Franklin. Thank you for making the time today." Franklin nodded, but didn't offer much more. The way he looked at her, just a little too long, told her everything. He hadn't expected someone like her in this room, especially not someone so accomplished, so poised. He had heard of her, of course, the well-known surgeon and philanthropist. But that was only half of the picture in his eyes. The other half was a woman who had somehow broken through. Someone who didn't quite fit the mold. As they sat down, Dahlia kept her posture neutral, but her mind was on alert. She knew exactly how this would unfold. It was all part of the game. She had already rehearsed her points in her head, but she couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the room, the way Franklin kept his distance, his gaze always darting between his notes and her, never truly focusing on her for too long. The conversation began with small talk, details about upcoming projects, logistical matters. But Dahlia could feel the undertones of their exchanges shifting. It was in the way Franklin over-explained things to her, as if assuming she wouldn't understand the complexities of legal proceedings. "I just want to make sure we're all clear on the proper procedure, Dr. Thomas," he said, his voice a touch condescending, even though the information he was giving her was nothing new. Dahlia nodded politely, her composure unbroken. But inside, something was tightening in her chest. He assumed because she was a woman, and a woman of color, that she didn't know how to navigate these spaces. He had assumed that she wouldn't be able to see through his patronizing tone, but she had learned how to play these games long ago. The conversation continued, and as expected, Franklin began steering it toward the subject of funding. Dahlia had come to advocate for resources to be allocated to health services for people in low-income neighborhoods, especially minority communities. She laid out her arguments with the precision of a surgeon, but Franklin's response was always the same: evasions, distractions, a polite refusal masked as concern. "I understand the need, Dr. Thomas," he said, leaning back in his chair, his hands clasped together. "But we need to look at the bigger picture. These aren't just healthcare budgets we're talking about, they're taxpayer dollars. The people in your community need to prove that they're willing to contribute to society before we make such large-scale investments." Dahlia clenched her jaw, but didn't let the irritation show. He was playing the game. The old game. The one where they questioned the worthiness of black communities to receive resources, as if their needs were always secondary to other priorities. She felt the sharp sting of his words, but she didn't flinch. "Not here. Not now." "The evidence doesn't lie, Judge," Dahlia said, her voice cool. "The disparities are real, and they affect lives. We're not asking for handouts, we're asking for equity. I'm here today to make sure those who have been forgotten aren't left behind." Franklin's eyes flicked to his watch, his posture shifting. She could feel the impatience building in him. He didn't like this, didn't like being challenged, being made to see the truth that didn't fit his narrative. But Dahlia wasn't finished, not by a long shot. As the meeting wound down, Dahlia felt the familiar frustration rise within her, but she maintained her composure. Franklin had no intention of taking any real action today, and she knew it. He was just going through the motions, playing the part of the polite gatekeeper while keeping his foot firmly on the neck of real change. She rose from her chair and extended her hand. "Thank you for your time, Judge Franklin. I'll be in touch with my team." His handshake was brief. No warmth, no connection. But Dahlia wasn't expecting it. As she stepped out of the courthouse and back into the bustling streets, her thoughts were sharper than ever. The fight was far from over. In fact, this was just the beginning. Dahlia had learned one thing. In a world where the system was built to undermine you, you had to build your own path, even if that meant walking a road filled with hostility. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Dahlia sat alone in her office late into the evening, the hum of the fluorescent lights above breaking the silence. Her fingers drummed the desk impatiently as she stared at the stack of files in front of her. Despite all her achievements and the considerable influence she wielded in the healthcare world, there was always something holding her back. The institutional weight of the systems that had been built to serve the privileged and the powerful, not people like her. People who had to fight for every inch of recognition. She had thought she was prepared for this, but the latest exchange with Judge Franklin had made it clear just how much further she needed to go. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She glanced down, reading the message from Langston, her lawyer. It was a reminder about the upcoming meeting with the state's medical board, where she would present her plans for community-based healthcare reform. The meeting would be critical, as the board's approval would allow her to implement these plans on a larger scale, something she had worked tirelessly for. Yet, as much as she prepared, she knew the undercurrent of resistance would be there. The old guard, the ones who made up most of the board, weren't inclined to trust someone like her, a black woman in a position of power, navigating the corridors of wealth and influence. Dahlia knew what was coming. She had seen it before. She had faced it her whole life, those subtle acts of prejudice and disdain that masqueraded as professionalism. The subtle way they made you feel like you didn't belong, that you didn't deserve the same respect as others in the room, and worse, they didn't realize they were doing it. Dahlia had learned long ago that she couldn't afford to let the weight of their bias deter her, but as the days wore on, it became harder and harder to ignore. The next day, as Dahlia entered the conference room for the board meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. She could already feel the stares of the other members as they gathered around the large oval table, their eyes lingering on her for just a second too long before they turned their focus elsewhere. The old men in suits, who had spent decades in this same room, acting as gatekeepers to any real change, made no effort to hide their skepticism. Dahlia took her seat at the head of the table, the weight of their eyes on her like an invisible force. She greeted each of them calmly, offering the firm handshakes and warm smiles that had become her armor. As the meeting began, the dialogue was as expected. Policy discussions, financials, projections. It wasn't until she started presenting her community healthcare initiative that the true colors of the room began to show. "Dr. Thomas, I understand your passion for these underserved communities," one of the board members, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Gregory Hale, began, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the proposal. "But I think we need to consider the practicality of this. We can't just throw resources at areas without clear accountability. People are irresponsible. They don't respect the work we're trying to do here." The implication was clear. Gregory Hale didn't believe that the people Dahlia was trying to help deserved healthcare resources unless they earned it. Something he had never had to consider in his lifetime. His words hung in the air like a challenge, like he was daring Dahlia to prove otherwise. Dahlia's heart rate quickened, but her expression remained neutral. She had heard this argument before. It was one that had been used to keep marginalized people in a constant state of struggle, never allowing them the resources they needed to rise above their circumstances. She exhaled slowly, her voice even as she responded. "Respect, Mr. Hale, doesn't come from your charity. It comes from the opportunity to prove one's worth. My plan isn't about charity, it's about fairness. It's about recognizing that healthcare, like education, should be a right, not a privilege." There was a ripple of murmurs across the room. Dahlia knew she was speaking to an audience that had never been forced to confront the everyday injustices that she and so many others had. They had been afforded opportunities from the start, had been given a seat at the table, while people like her were forced to fight for every inch. Gregory's lips twisted into a thin smile. "I'm not sure we're quite ready to take such a bold step, Dr. Thomas. Perhaps some of these ideas could be tested in smaller pilot programs first." It was the same line of questioning she had faced before. The slow, methodical pushback that never seemed to end. Every suggestion, every idea, met with a dozen roadblocks. But Dahlia had anticipated this. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to force their hand. The meeting stretched on, and Dahlia could feel the slow churn of frustration inside her. She had expected resistance, but not on this level, not this outright dismissal. Finally, after an hour of pushing back against their excuses and suggestions for watered-down solutions, it happened. As she was in the middle of presenting new data to prove her point, one of the board members, a woman named Evelyn Maxwell, interrupted her. Evelyn was one of the few women in the room, but Dahlia could tell that she was just as entrenched in the old ways as the men. Her tone was condescending, dripping with the implication that Dahlia wasn't up to the task. "Dr. Thomas," Evelyn said, raising a hand and cutting her off, "with all due respect, it's clear you have the qualifications for this position, but we're not talking about your qualifications, we're talking about whether you can influence the communities you're attempting to serve, and frankly, this initiative is idealistic, and I'm not convinced the results would match the investment." The word stung. Not because Evelyn didn't agree with her, but because it was clear that Evelyn saw Dahlia's work as nice, but not practical. She was reducing it to a buzzword, calling it idealistic, as if people's lives were simply some theoretical experiment. Dahlia could see the same subtle dismissal she had encountered so many times before, in the dismissive glances from the others in the room. It wasn't about the money, it was about the belief that communities like hers were somehow lesser, not deserving of proper health care. Dahlia knew she had to make a stand now. This isn't about your investment, Ms. Maxwell. This is about the very real lives of people who have been left to suffer for too long, Dahlia said, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet fury. You can hide behind the numbers and the charts all you want, but the truth is, the system has failed these people, and I'm not asking you to do anything heroic, I'm asking you to do what's right. The silence that followed felt like a thick blanket pressing down on the room. Dahlia's heart pounded in her chest. But she stood her ground, unwavering. Gregory Hale cleared his throat, his voice cold. Well, Dr. Thomas, if you're so confident that this is the right course of action, then I suppose we'll see what kind of support you have outside of this boardroom. Dahlia's eyes narrowed. I'll take that as a challenge, Mr. Hale. As the meeting ended, Dahlia stepped out of the room and into the hallway, her mind swirling with the weight of the confrontation. She wasn't surprised by their lack of support, but the sting of being underestimated, of being made to feel like her vision was idealistic, burned deep. But Dahlia wasn't done, not by a long shot. She had prepared for this moment. She had anticipated the pushback, the subtle racial biases, and the patronizing tone. And now, she would have to take this fight to the people. She had the data, the testimonials, and the moral high ground. The next step was clear. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed again. It was Langston, telling her that the protests she had helped organize for police accountability had grown larger, and the media attention was intensifying. The charges against the officers who had framed her brother, Marcus, were now front-page news. But that wasn't all. A new scandal had begun to brew, one involving members of the very board she had just left. Someone had tipped off the press about their ties to private healthcare companies that stood to lose millions if her reforms succeeded. Dahlia exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. The stakes had just gotten much higher. The battle wasn't just in the boardroom, it was about to play out in the public eye. As she drove through the city, the lights reflecting off the glass buildings, Dahlia's resolve hardened. It was time to take the fight beyond these walls and into the streets. The people would decide if the status quo would stand, or if real change would finally take place. Dahlia's mind raced as she sped through the city streets, her thoughts echoing louder than the hum of the engine. The latest confrontation in the boardroom had shaken her, but it hadn't stopped her. It had only fueled her resolve. The weight of the system's indifference, its bias, its unwillingness to change, pressed heavily on her chest, but with every step, every moment, Dahlia felt herself growing stronger. The world outside her car window blurred as the city's skyscrapers cast long shadows in the waning daylight. Dahlia gripped the steering wheel tightly, focusing on the task ahead. The protests had already begun to escalate. More people were showing up each day, demanding accountability, demanding change. But it wasn't enough yet. Not for her, not for Marcus, and certainly not for the countless other victims who had been silenced by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. The systems that, for too long, had worked in favor of the wealthy, the powerful, the white. Her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Langston, her lawyer. She opened it quickly, scanning the message. The media storm was growing. Whispers of corruption among the board members were spreading like wildfire. Someone had leaked information about their ties to private healthcare companies that stood to lose millions if Dahlia's healthcare reform plan succeeded. The media had already started to investigate, and Dahlia's name was all over the news. But this wasn't the tipping point. Not yet. That moment was still to come. The rally was packed, the streets flooded with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus, End Police Brutality, and Healthcare is a Right, Not a Privilege." Dahlia had organized the protest as a way to build momentum, to show the world that her fight was not just about healthcare reform, but about the systemic corruption that had plagued every facet of society. She needed to make sure people knew just how deep the rot ran, how far the corruption went, from the police force to the very halls of power where deals were made in secret, at the expense of the vulnerable. Standing in the middle of the crowd, Her eyes scanned the faces around her. Some were passionate, others were there out of a sense of duty, and some were there because they had heard of Marcus's case and felt compelled to stand for what was right. It didn't matter why they were here. What mattered was that they were here. Dahlia needed them. She needed this momentum to turn into something bigger. Langston had already told her that the police were likely going to try to crack down on the protests. The mayor's office had been receiving calls from powerful individuals, people who wanted this protest to disappear, people who were threatened by the potential change that Dahlia was leading. They couldn't let her push forward, not if they could help it. And that's when Dahlia knew it was no longer about healthcare or about Marcus. It was about exposing the lies, the corruption, the systems that allowed people like Paul Wright and Daniel Moore to thrive without consequence. The sound of a police siren sliced through the air, followed by the sudden rush of officers in riot gear. Dahlia's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the front of the protest, where a line of officers had formed, blocking the street. The protesters hadn't yet reached the point of violence, but the officers weren't waiting for that. They were here to send a message. This protest was not welcome. She stood her ground, though her mind was working faster than her heart could beat. The media was already recording, but Dahlia knew that no matter what they saw, the narrative could still be spun in the police's favor. She had to make sure this didn't turn into another news cycle where the police got to play the victim and the protesters were demonized. "Everyone stay calm," Dahlia shouted, raising her arms in an attempt to bring some order to the chaos. "Don't let them provoke you." But the tension in the air was undeniable. The police were here with one objective: to disperse the crowd, to silence the voices, to make sure Dahlia's message never reached the ears of the wider public. And Dahlia wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Not when the stakes were this high. As the officers advanced, pushing the crowd back with shields and batons, Dahlia saw someone move in the crowd. Mitchell. He was a young activist she had met a few months ago, and his presence in the protest was a surprise. He was normally quiet, hesitant, unsure about his role in the larger fight. But today, there was something different about him. His face was set with a determination that was new, and for the first time, Dahlia could see the fire inside him. "Mitchell!" she shouted, her voice rising above the noise. "Stay back." But Mitchell wasn't listening. He was charging forward, heading straight for the line of police officers. Dahlia's heart sank, but before she could act, the officers were already making their move. One of them, Officer Daniels, stepped forward, pulling Mitchell to the ground with a force that made the crowd gasp. The cameras were rolling. Dahlia could see the media, the news outlets, capturing every moment. This was it, the moment where the balance of power would tip, where everything would be laid bare for the world to see. She couldn't let it go to waste. "Stop! Let him go!" Dahlia shouted, pushing through the crowd, her voice sharp and commanding, but the officers didn't stop. Officer Daniels shoved Mitchell roughly to the ground again, and that was when the crowd began to panic. Dahlia's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan, this wasn't supposed to happen. She had always managed to stay in control, always knew how to keep her cool and lead others with confidence. But now, it was different. The anger surged inside her, and the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about policies anymore. It wasn't about fighting for healthcare reform. This was about standing against a system that had been broken for so long. About fighting back against the very institutions that had enabled corruption, brutality, and inequality. She took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and turned to the protesters, her voice rising above the noise. "This is our moment. They can't stop us now. Stand your ground." The crowd, sensing the change, began to push back against the officers. The tension was unbearable, but Dahlia's voice cut through it. The police were still trying to regain control, pushing forward with their shields. But the people were no longer afraid. They had seen it. What had happened to Marcus, what had happened to Dahlia, and now, they were ready to fight back. Officer Daniels was standing now, trying to regain his composure, but Dahlia could see the fear in his eyes. They had underestimated her, underestimated the power of the people. And now, there was no turning back. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Dahlia's pulse quickened. It wasn't just the police trying to suppress the protest anymore. It was something bigger. She knew they had a plan to break this movement, to make her seem like the problem, to force her into a corner. But Dahlia wasn't backing down. Not now, not when they had taken the first step toward real change. The truth was out. The footage from the protest would spread like wildfire. Just like the footage of the officers planting drugs on Marcus and Dahlia would make sure it didn't stop here. She would take this all the way, through the streets, through the media, through the courts, and into the hearts of every person who had been ignored, abused, and silenced by the system. The stakes were higher now than ever before. The conflict had reached its peak, and it was only a matter of time before everything would change. The sun had long dipped behind the skyline, casting the protest into a haze of orange and pink as the chaos on the street continued. The police officers had retreated for a moment, seemingly regrouping, but the tension in the air was palpable. Dahlia stood at the forefront of the crowd, feeling a mixture of determination and disbelief. The words of her lawyer Langston rang in her mind. "The stakes have never been higher, Dahlia. You need to be prepared to lose everything to win this fight." It felt like a lie at the moment, like everything had already been lost. Marcus, her brother, still languished behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, and the system was still rigged in favor of the powerful and the corrupt. But as she watched the crowd gather their courage, her determination only grew stronger. Then, her heart skipped a beat. From behind the barrier of police officers, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a cold, calculating gaze. Officer Paul Wright. The same officer who had orchestrated the arrest that had sent her brother to prison. The same officer who had planted evidence, lied in court, and crushed lives for his own gain. Dahlia's stomach twisted. She'd been preparing for this moment, but seeing him in person made it feel too real. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and the fire that had been smoldering inside her suddenly burned brighter. He had hurt so many people. He had hurt Marcus. Without thinking, Dahlia took a step forward, her voice rising above the noise of the crowd. "You thought this would be easy, didn't you, Paul?" she called out. Paul froze, momentarily caught off guard by her words. His eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment, Dahlia saw something shift in him. Something between surprise and anger. He had underestimated her, thinking she was just another person he could intimidate into silence. "You think this is some game?" he called back, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You don't know who you're messing with. You and your little band of protesters don't stand a chance." Dahlia didn't flinch. "You're right. It's not a game. This is about lives you've ruined, lives you've destroyed, and you're not going to get away with it this time. Not this time." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd quieted for a moment, the tension between Dahlia and Paul electric. The officers around Paul shifted uncomfortably, as if they could sense the impending clash. But Paul didn't back down. Instead, he smirked, his hands resting on the baton at his side. "You're not in control here, Dahlia, I am," he sneered. "You think the people are going to believe you? You've got nothing. No evidence, just a bunch of angry people who want change, but don't know how to get it." The words stung, but Dahlia refused to let him see the effect they had on her. She knew better than to let him get inside her head. The cameras were on them now, flashing lights capturing every word, every gesture, every moment. If Paul thought he could silence her by intimidation, he was wrong. This wasn't just about the protest anymore, it was about exposing the truth. Dahlia squared her shoulders, her voice clear and unwavering. "You think I don't have evidence?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to him. "I've got more than just the footage of you planting evidence on my brother. I've got the records of every arrest you've made, every person you've hurt, and it's all going public. The world is going to see you for what you really are." Paul's expression faltered for a moment. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't anticipated that Dahlia had already taken the necessary steps to bring him down, to expose his corruption to the world. "You think you can just play the hero and save the day?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You and your brother are just two more people who've fallen through the cracks of a system that doesn't care about people like you." Dahlia's heart raced, but she stayed calm, her breath steady. Her mind was already several steps ahead of him. She had anticipated every move, every argument Paul would throw her way. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by people like Paul, by a system that thrived on injustice and inequality. "You're wrong," Dahlia said, her voice low but steady. "You think people like me don't matter. You think the truth doesn't matter. The truth is, the people are waking up. They're not going to ignore what you've done any longer. And when I'm done with you, the world is going to know exactly who you are." For a moment, Paul's face went pale. His grip tightened around his baton, but the confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by something darker. Something more desperate. He hadn't prepared for this level of resistance. Dahlia could see it in his eyes. The realization that his power, his influence, was slipping through his fingers. He wasn't the one in control anymore. "You think I care about what the world thinks?" Paul sneered, his voice now tinged with panic. "You're nothing. You and your little protest are nothing. I'll make sure you're both destroyed, and no one will care. You won't win." Dahlia took another step forward, closing the distance between them. She was standing tall now, the crowd behind her watching, waiting. "You're already lost, Paul. Your time is up. This isn't just about Marcus anymore. It's about all the people you've hurt, the people who never had a chance to fight back, the people you thought you could bury. But you're wrong." Her words landed like a slap. Paul's eyes flicked nervously to the side, looking for an escape. He knew what she was saying was true. He had lost. There was nothing he could do to stop it now. "You'll regret this," Paul muttered, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You don't know what's coming for you." Dahlia didn't flinch. "I've been fighting this system my whole life, and I'm not stopping now." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The crowd, the police, the city. Everything around Dahlia faded into the background as she locked eyes with Paul. There was no fear, no hesitation. There was only the truth. And the truth had a way of cutting through all the noise, all the lies, all the corruption. The police officers, now realizing the gravity of the situation, began to shuffle uneasily. Some exchanged glances, others stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. Paul, who had been the orchestrator of so much pain, stood at the center of it all, trying to project authority, but failing miserably. Dahlia's heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed focused. The moment had arrived. The truth was about to take over. Suddenly, the tension broke. A loud shout rang through the air, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Dahlia turned, instinctively protecting herself as Officer Daniels, the other officer who had been complicit in the arrest of Marcus, rushed toward her. He had a look of rage in his eyes, and before she could react, he shoved her hard against a nearby police barricade. The impact knocked the air out of her lungs, but she didn't go down. She gritted her teeth, her anger surging. This was it. This was the moment where everything could either break or fall into place. As Officer Daniels reached for his handcuffs, Dahlia's mind clicked into overdrive. She wasn't just going to let him arrest her. Not this time. The people were already watching, and they were waiting for her to take control. "Enough!" Dahlia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The crowd went silent, and even Officer Daniels froze for a moment. The cameras were still rolling, the footage still streaming. Dahlia had to make this count. This was the final confrontation, the moment where the truth would finally be undeniable. And as Officer Daniels reached for her again, she made her move. Dahlia's heart thudded in her chest as Officer Daniels grabbed her arm, forcing her against the barricade. The weight of his hand was oppressive, and her breath caught in her throat as he leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "You're not getting away with this," he spat, his grip tightening as he attempted to yank her arms behind her back. "You've made a huge mistake. The system doesn't care about people like you." Dahlia felt a surge of fury rise within her, but it was quickly tempered by the voice in her head that told her to stay calm. Every move she made, every word she spoke, had to count. She was more than just a protester in this moment. She was the voice of countless lives destroyed by men like Officer Daniels and Paul Wright. With a deliberate slowness, she placed her hand on the officer's wrist. His fingers twitched, as though to tighten their grip, but Dahlia was quicker. She twisted her body, ducking under his arm and forcing him to stumble forward slightly. Her movements were fluid, controlled. She had trained for moments like this. The crowd was watching. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, and this time, she wasn't going to let it slip away. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor of adrenaline in her veins. "People like you, people who think they can crush others with their badges, are finished. It's over." Daniels turned sharply, his face flushed with rage. His hand shot out, but Dahlia was ready. She blocked his swing, pivoting, stepping to the side with the grace of a fighter who had done this before. The sheer force of his swing missed, and Dahlia could see his eyes widen in realization. She wasn't a victim anymore. She had control of this fight. "You think you can take me down?" Officer Daniels sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're just another angry woman with a camera and a cause. You don't know what it's like to have power." Dahlia stood tall, facing him without a flinch, her jaw set, her eyes hard, but there was a calm in her that she hadn't known before. This wasn't just about the arrests. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This was about a lifetime of injustice, a history of abuse that had finally caught up with them. "I know exactly what it's like to have power," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, like a knife slicing through steel. "The power of truth. The power of what's right. And you, Officer Daniels, are a symbol of everything that's wrong with this system." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. His eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, trying to intimidate her with his towering presence. "You have no idea what you're up against," he growled. "You think your little footage is going to change anything? You think the system is going to listen to you? You're nothing." Dahlia's eyes flashed, and she could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. The system had always ignored her. It had always ignored people like her, like Marcus, like all the other black men and women who had been oppressed for generations. But this time, the system would hear her. With a deliberate motion, Dahlia reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small device, holding it up for him to see. It was a simple but effective tool, a small, hidden camera, one that had been recording everything from the moment she entered the protest. The footage was already live streaming, already being watched by millions. The message was clear. Officer Daniels and his colleagues weren't untouchable anymore. "You're wrong," Dahlia said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you've hurt, and the world is watching you now. I've got all the proof I need. Your time is over." For a moment, Daniels hesitated. His eyes flicked to the device in her hand, and the change in him was subtle, but Dahlia saw it. He was calculating, trying to figure out his next move. He didn't realize it yet, but Dahlia had already won. "You think you can intimidate me with that?" Daniels said, his voice now a little quieter, a little more uncertain. He took a step back, but it was too late. Dahlia had already turned the tables. "Intimidation doesn't work on me anymore," she said. "You can't scare me. I've seen too much, I've felt too much. But what's even scarier is that people like you think you can keep getting away with this." His face twisted, a mask of rage and frustration. He stepped toward her again, but this time, there was something more primal in his movements. His eyes narrowed, and Dahlia saw the fear in him, the fear of being exposed, of losing the power he had enjoyed for so long. "You don't know what you're starting," he said in a low voice, practically spitting the words. "You think this is over. You think this footage is going to save you. The system won't care about a few angry protesters with cameras. We run this city, not you. You're just a small piece in a much bigger game." Dahlia's eyes burned with the fury of generations. She'd heard it all before. The threats, the intimidation, the empty promises that the powerful would always win. But not this time. "I'm not just a protester," Dahlia said. "And you're not just a cop. You're a symbol of everything that's broken in this system. You're the reason my brother is in prison. You're the reason countless people are hurting, but you're not the one who gets to decide how this ends. We do, and I'm done being silent." The crowd around them stirred, and the sound of their voices swelled into a roar. The pressure was building. They were ready to fight, ready to stand behind her. She wasn't alone anymore. Daniels looked around, his expression wavering, his fists clenching and unclenching in frustration. He could feel it, the collective weight of all those watching. The tide was turning against him, and he knew it. The people he had hurt, the system he had abused, it was all coming for him now. But Dahlia didn't wait for him to make another move. She pressed the button on her device, her finger trembling only slightly, and the footage began to flood the internet, breaking into every major news station, every platform. "Look around, Daniels," she said, her voice steady, but heavy with the truth. "Your time is over. You've crossed a line you can't come back from." As the feed went live, The anger in Daniel's eyes intensified, but so did his fear. His smugness cracked, revealing the man who had spent years hiding behind the shield of power and privilege. The revelation of his corruption wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a reality he could no longer avoid. "You're finished," Dahlia said quietly, as the cameras flashed and the crowd's roar reached a deafening crescendo. "And I'm not going anywhere until you are." Daniels took one last desperate step toward her, but Dahlia held her ground. She had already won. There was nothing more to prove, but just as she felt the weight of victory settle in her chest, a sharp voice broke through the tension. "Step back!" shouted Officer Wright, his voice cracking with panic as he rushed into the scene, his eyes darting around. Paul Wright, the man who had orchestrated everything, the lies, the planting of evidence, the destruction of lives, was here too. He had always been the puppet master, and now, it seemed, the puppet was finally breaking free. "Get her!" Paul shouted to his fellow officers, his voice laced with desperation. "We can still stop this! We can still make it right!" But it was too late. The crowd erupted into chants of "Justice for Marcus" and "No justice, no peace." The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them, and Dahlia knew that this was it. The final, irreversible turning point. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from her lawyer Langston. "It's done. The footage is everywhere. They're finished." Dahlia took one last look at the two officers, now realizing their worst fear had come true. The truth was out, and there was no going back. But before she could fully process the magnitude of her victory, Paul made one last, desperate attempt. He lunged toward her, but in that split second, Dahlia knew exactly what she had to do. Dahlia stood frozen for a moment as Paul Wright lunged toward her. The chaos of the crowd around her seemed to slow, the buzz of anticipation and the chanting voices muffling everything else. In that brief, suspended second, Dahlia felt the weight of everything: her brother Marcus, the countless others who had suffered, the weight of the truth she had fought for. She didn't move as he came at her. Instead, she held her ground. It wasn't a physical confrontation she had wanted, but she knew that this moment, with everything on the line, was now unavoidable. As Paul got closer, his face twisted with the panic and anger of a man who knew his time was up, Dahlia took a deep breath, ready to finally finish what she had started. Before Paul could lay a hand on her, Officer Daniels made the critical mistake of stepping forward. His hand reached out, likely to restrain her, but Dahlia saw him just in time. With a swift motion, she sidestepped, using Daniels's own momentum to push him toward Paul. The two officers collided with a harsh grunt, tumbling to the ground in a tangled heap. It wasn't the most graceful moment, but it was enough to send a shockwave through the crowd. The officers' once dominant authority, their power over the situation, had shattered in an instant. The crowd roared, chanting louder than before, "No justice, no peace." The sound seemed to echo against the walls, the city itself seeming to breathe with them. Dahlia didn't waste any more time. She pulled her phone from her pocket and pressed a button, instantly sending the footage of the confrontation, her face unwavering, her eyes focused. The camera captured the chaos of the officers trying to regain their bearings, the fear on their faces as they realized that the world was now watching them, that there would be no hiding from their actions. Paul was on his feet now, his anger palpable, his breath ragged. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you can just take us down with a phone and a few lies?" His voice was hoarse, wild, desperate. Dahlia locked eyes with him, and for the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of the truth. "You're not untouchable," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "You never were." His face went pale. His hands, once so confident, now trembled as he looked around at the crowd that had gathered, their phones raised, their eyes glued to their screens. It was over. The proof was everywhere. The world had seen what they had done to her, to Marcus, and to so many others. The sound of sirens pierced the air as backup arrived, but it wasn't the usual flashing red and blue that signaled reinforcement. These sirens were different. They were for the officers who had crossed the line, for the corrupt system that had been exposed. Dahlia could feel the shift in the air as new faces emerged. People from the community who had been watching, ready to ensure that Paul and Daniels could no longer escape the justice they deserved. A new wave of law enforcement arrived, ones who were there to make sure the law was followed. ones who understood what it meant to serve and protect, and who weren't tied up in the web of power that had corrupted the system. They moved in, efficiently and with purpose, and as they approached, Paul and Daniels froze. "Step back," one of the officers said, his voice stern. "You two are under arrest." The world seemed to come alive in that instant, the crowd surging forward with a collective cheer. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it was the beginning of something far more important. The foundation of accountability had been set. The power of the people, fueled by truth and unflinching resolve, had torn down a wall that had stood for far too long. Dahlia's phone buzzed again. It was Langston, her lawyer. "It's starting internal affairs is already on the case. They've opened an investigation into their entire department. The footage you captured, it's being broadcast everywhere. The wheels are turning." She could hardly believe it. The enormity of the moment settled in. What had started as one woman standing up for her brother was now becoming a movement, a moment of reckoning for everyone who had been silenced and oppressed. "Justice is coming for them," Dahlia whispered to herself, a quiet satisfaction in her heart. Her gaze turned toward the officers being led away, their heads hung low in defeat. "But it's not just for them, it's for Marcus." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of frustration or anger. They were tears of relief, of triumph. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. The confrontation was only the beginning, and Dahlia knew that the battle for justice would continue, but this time, it wouldn't be as easy for the corrupt to silence the voices calling for change. The power had shifted. The following weeks moved quickly. The footage went viral, flooding social media, news stations, and online platforms. It wasn't just a local incident anymore. It was a national one. The conversations about police brutality, racial profiling, and systemic corruption reached a boiling point. People shared their stories, their pain, and the system began to feel the pressure. Internal Affairs launched a thorough investigation into the entire department, opening up cases dating back years. What had once been a few isolated incidents was now becoming a tidal wave of revelations. The scope of corruption was staggering. Investigators pored over every case that Paul Wright and Officer Daniels had been involved in, uncovering a web of lies, manipulation, and abuse of power. And as the investigations progressed, Dahlia was faced with a new reality. The shift she had initiated, through sheer determination and courage, was beginning to ignite the kind of change she had only dreamed of. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been wronged, every black individual who had faced prejudice, every innocent life destroyed by an unjust system. But even as the calls for reform grew louder, there was a lingering uncertainty. As much as the officers' reputations had been tarnished, as much as the wheels of justice were turning, the fight was far from over. The system was still broken, still resistant to real change. The road ahead would be long, and Dahlia knew it. She had learned that the true cost of change wasn't just in the fight against those who abused their power, but in the fight against an entrenched system that had made their abuse possible in the first place. And so, as the weeks wore on, Dahlia continued to fight, not just for her brother's freedom, not just for the truth that had been buried, but for the future, for the day when the system no longer held power over those who fought for justice, for the day when power no longer corrupted, when those in charge truly served and protected. And, though the victory was sweet, Dahlia knew it was just the beginning. She wasn't done yet. Dahlia sat on the steps of the courthouse, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the city stretched out before her. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden hue, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold weight that had settled in her chest for years. It had been weeks since the officers, Paul Wright and Daniels, had been arrested, and their crimes exposed. Yet, even now, as the world began to shift in ways Dahlia had only dreamed of, she couldn't shake the feeling that her work was far from over. When she had started this journey, it had been about justice for her brother, Marcus. But as she watched the crowds dissipating from the courthouse steps, their cheers fading into the distance, she realized it was so much more than that now. It was about the countless others who had been forgotten, ignored, or silenced by a system designed to serve only the powerful. The systemic corruption that had allowed people like Paul and Daniels to continue their reign of terror had reached far beyond those two men. It had been woven into the very fabric of the institution, from the streets to the courts, from the police to the government. And while the public exposure of their crimes was a huge victory, Dahlia knew that the fight for systemic change was just beginning. She stood up, brushing the dust from her pants. Her body was still sore from the days of tension and confrontation. But there was something different now. A strength she hadn't known she possessed had risen within her, born from the courage she had summoned when everything felt hopeless. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, she thought. It was about reshaping a broken system, about ensuring that the truth, no matter how painful or inconvenient, had a place in the world. Her victory, Marcus's freedom, the exposure of the officer's misconduct, had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have predicted. The personal journey. When Dahlia first began this journey, she had been angry, consumed by the weight of her brother's unjust conviction, by the corruption of the system that had failed him and countless others. It had been her pain, her anger, that fueled her every step. But over time, as she fought and struggled, and saw the resistance she encountered, she learned that there was so much more to justice than vengeance. Dahlia had grown from someone who sought retribution to someone who sought change, not just for her brother, but for the entire system that had allowed this to happen. She had learned to channel her anger, her fear, into something powerful and constructive. She had learned that courage wasn't just about standing tall in the face of injustice, but also about knowing when to move with quiet determination, when to take a step back and allow the truth to do its work. And now, as the dust settled around her, she found herself in a different place. There was no end to the battle, but there was progress. Paul and Daniels had been held accountable. The footage had forced the world to pay attention to the injustices that had been normalized, but this wasn't a story that would end with their downfall. No, this was just the beginning. There was so much more to fix, so many more people to hold accountable. The growth Dahlia had experienced wasn't just about her newfound strength, but about the understanding that she wasn't alone. She had allies now, a whole community standing behind her, those who had supported her, and those who had found their voices because of her actions. Her journey had become their journey, her fight, their fight. And that, more than anything else, gave her the drive to keep going. Broader implications. The fight for justice had always been bigger than Dahlia. It wasn't just about one officer or one corrupt system. It was about a world that had forgotten how to listen, how to see people for who they really were, to acknowledge their humanity, their worth, their rights. It was about seeing people like Marcus, who had been swallowed by a system built to oppress, and realizing that his story was not an isolated one. As the investigation into the department deepened, more victims came forward. Their stories were heartbreaking but crucial. It wasn't just about what Paul and Daniels had done to Dahlia and Marcus. It was about every person they had wronged over the years, every black man or woman they had falsely accused, every soul they had trampled on to maintain their power. The layers of corruption ran deep, and as the public and legal investigations unraveled them, it became clear that this was not just an isolated case. Dahlia's fight was a spark that had ignited a fire for reform. Across the country, people were beginning to ask questions, to challenge the status quo. Protests grew larger, louder, not only calling for justice for Marcus, but demanding broader changes in policing practices. Calls for accountability, for transparency, for an end to systemic racism echoed through the streets, through every media channel, and in the halls of government. It wasn't easy. Of course, change never came easily. Dahlia knew that the battle for justice was far from over. Paul and Daniels were only two figures in a much larger system that was resistant to change, and those in power weren't going to give up without a fight. But as the public demanded answers, as pressure mounted, there was a glimmer of hope that things could, in fact, change. And that was what Dahlia had fought for, all along. Inspiration and moving forward. Though Dahlia had won a victory, the road ahead was still uncertain. She knew that change, real change, took time, and that her fight would continue in new ways. It would require vigilance, patience, and persistence. The world would try to move on, to bury the injustice in the past, and pretend it was a chapter already closed. But Dahlia would not let them forget. She had seen the power of truth, the power of standing firm in the face of adversity, and she would use that power to keep pushing forward. The fight had taken a toll on Dahlia. The emotional and physical exhaustion of the battle was real, and there were moments when she had doubted herself, when she had wondered if she was making any difference at all. But now, with everything unfolding, with the realization that change was within reach, the fatigue felt less heavy. She had made an impact, she had done what so many others were too afraid to do, she had given people the courage to speak out. In the days after the trial, Dahlia received countless messages, letters, and social media posts from people thanking her for her bravery. They spoke of how her story had inspired them to take a stand, to demand more from the system. And that, in itself, was enough to fuel her next steps. Her journey had been difficult, but the most important lesson she had learned was that change didn't happen in isolation. It wasn't just about her. It was about the collective action of a community of people who cared. It was about allies, advocates, and survivors coming together to demand justice, to refuse to accept the way things had always been. The most difficult part of all this was the realization that the fight was never truly over, but Dahlia was ready. She had already started planning her next steps, whether that meant working with organizations dedicated to police reform or speaking out on a broader platform. She would make sure the conversation about accountability didn't stop. For the first time in years, Dahlia felt hope. Emotional closure. The story of Dahlia and Marcus wasn't just a story of personal triumph. It was a reflection of the strength of all those who had been silenced. It was about standing up for what was right, about facing overwhelming odds and refusing to back down. It was about the courage to speak the truth, no matter the cost. And as Dahlia walked away from the courthouse steps, surrounded by the love and support of her family and community, she knew that while the fight was far from over, the world was waking up. There was progress, there was hope, and that was enough to carry her forward, to continue her fight, and to help others find their voice. For Dahlia, the battle had never just been about a single victory, it had been about sparking a movement, and as the world watched, they saw not just one woman standing tall, but an entire generation rising up to demand change. The truth had been heard. The fight for justice had only just begun, and Dahlia would be there every step of the way, fighting not just for her brother, but for everyone who deserved to be heard.